Hi everybody, we're so excited today to have Mr. Gilbert Hakim speak on socioeconomics. Mr. Gilbert Hakim is a philanthropist who is dedicated to the promotion of an ever-advancing civilization. From his work with educational institutions and health clinics to date, Mr. Hakim has shown his commitment to service to the entire human race. Mr. Hakim abides by the principle that humanity shares one identity, one common creator, and one common destiny. Mr. Hakim graduated from Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York, with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a Master of Science in Computer Science and Applied Mathematics. Driven to provide innovative and practical technological solutions to the allied healthcare industry, Mr. Hakim founded SCC Soft Computer in 1979. He focused on providing custom software programming to healthcare customers. Without any further introductions, we will now start our exploration on socioeconomics with Mr. Gilbert Hakim.
Great. Thank you very much for attending this. As you know, mathematicians have only decision-making process in mathematicians are black and white. So it's 0 or 1. There is no gray area. So you'll excuse me if I do not, I'm blunt in terms of presentation itself. We're trying to, most of the talk relates into history of socioeconomics and political systems that derived from those ideologies that occurred generally around the mid-1800s. That all the events that occurred since then, we try to examine and see what impact it did. But it's factual, basically not interpretive. So the discussion, and the reason is to show, especially for young people, to not meddle into politics and try to align themselves to one group or another, because it's really, reality is completely different than what is presented through today, through media or different groups or different movements in general. So we're going to talk about socialism, capitalism, impact of them in politics, US politics, and polarization, and a Baha'i view, and who we are and why the current political and economic system does not answer the questions and problems that the world community has as a whole. So socioeconomics is basically is a social science studying economic activities affecting the social process. Whether society is progressing, stagnating, regressing, and whether it's local, it has local impact and global impact as well. Now, we need to go back to mid-1800s, and these philosophies of socialism actually, and of course, the global view of this ideology occurred in the mid-1800s. And there were two distinct philosophies that was presented. And let's look at where were we in mid-1800s and why those ideologies occurred at that time, and whether those ideologies are applicable today. So you cannot take basically spick and shovel that existed centuries ago and try to build a road, and it would take you a few hundred years to finish the road. So this is really the reality that we need to look at of where those ideas came from, what humanity, what condition humanity was that socialism was presented. So if you look at mid-1800s on the extreme poverty, 94% of people of the world were in extreme poverty. That means that they were making less than $2 a day in 2015 dollars. That means that they were starving, basically. Basic education, 17% of people had basic education, just to how to live, not to read or write. Literacy was only 12%. Democracy was almost non-existent. Vaccination didn't exist. Child mortality was 43% within the first 5 years. So now you have to imagine what this socioeconomic system that basically presented socialism by, of course, Karl Marx was. So here we have two major ideologies. One came in, again, mid-1800s by Karl Marx, and he was splitting the society into two separate segments. One was the bourgeoisie, which was the people that had means of production, control of it, and the working class, which was called proletariat. And ironically, the philosophy was that only this power grab situation will get remedied through force. There is no alternative of clash of these two classes of capitalist and labor. There is no alternative. So what this goal was, which was very, very appealing at the time, and ironically, it may have been a necessary process for humanity to go through to get to the stage we are today. But their goal was abolishing the class system, liberate the labor, creation of labor unions, dominate the world through force. So the ideology of socialism is not local or limited to a particular country. And up to mid-70s, this philosophy was followed by adherents to socialism. Bringing unity to mankind, eliminate religion, creation of an egalitarian economic system, mandate state ownership. And some of these ideas still is floating around in universities and among our young people, which they don't quite understand where these things came from. Remember that mid-1800s and basically industrialization, beginning of industrialization of the world. And that's where the idea came from. And of course, bringing justice and harmony to the world. Another philosophy was basically ethical and was a Baha'i philosophy, which said, and came around 1844, brought about a similar promise of outcome, a blueprint of a society promoting unity of mankind, unity of religion, elimination of all kinds of prejudices, abolition of war and militarism, universal individual human rights, elimination of clergy class, cooperation of labor and capital, proponent of free market, safety net for individual in need, necessity of capital and interest. So this was the two major infusion of ideology that we see which one won and where is today's world are moving toward. Whether it's moving towards socialism or what the ethical model that Baha'i philosophy is presenting. So this is abolishing ecclesiastical class, which is a source of skirmishes today in many parts of the world, promotion of spiritual egalitarianism. That means they're all equal in the eyes of God. There is no distinction, and this is very important. No one can say that I'm closer to God than you are. and individuals are equal in the eyes of the law of the land. This is very important as well, which again still is not propagated even in the advanced economies and Western societies, where people that are in power have special privileges, which we'll find out actually. So this initiative, individual initiative, private ownership, promotion of unity of religion, not elimination of religion, is unity of religion. So this is the model that Baha'is believe brings harmony, justice and harmony to the world. Now, what is a free market that the Baha'i religion was promoting in the mid-1800s? It's an economic, a free market is a system which price and goods and services are self-regulated by open market and by consumers. In a free market, the laws and forces of supply and demand are free from any intervention by a government or any authorities. So all forms of economic privileges, monopolies, artificial scarcities, again, all these things are outside the free market. Again, what is this against regulated market? So proponent of the concept of free market contrast with regulated market, which is government intervention, whether it's tariff, restricted trade. Again, in an idealized free market economy, prices for goods and services are set freely by the forces of supply and demand, are allowed to reach a point of equilibrium without any intervention of governments. Okay, now capitalism. This capitalism actually didn't even exist before 1600. And majority of the ownership of the land and the country was basically in the hands of the people in power, the kings, rulers, warlords. So they owned everything. They owned people, they owned land, and so on and so forth. So this phenomenon started in around 1600, which private ownership of means of productions for profit was developed. Property rights, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, a price system, and competitive market in a capitalist market economy. And I believe it started in Venice, which merchants pooled their money and then created a cooperative to buy goods, put them on a ship and send it all over the world. And when the profit came back, they distributed. And this was the beginning of the capital market, generally. So socialism, again started in mid-1800s. It's a political, social, and economic philosophy encompassing economic, social system, social ownership, means of production, worker self-management of enterprise, include political theories, movements associated with these systems are basically ownership by public, collective, or cooperative of the equity. While no single definition encapsulates many types of socialism, social ownership is the one common element. Now, after a couple of hundred years, now we see only Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela are remnant of the purely socialist movement. So basically they disappeared. And these are countries that are in deep trouble and the worst places on earth. We should add Iran to it too, in a different form. So where did this new movement took a foothold? Actually, the whole process started in 1917 with Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So the horror of 20th century socialism, which was Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Mao, and Pol Pot, they're offspring of this movement in 1917, 70 years earlier, where Marx and Engels predicted the overthrow of bourgeoisie rule would require violence and a dictatorship of the proletariat. That means the labor. Again, Lenin conducted weeding out, discrimination, terrors, and so on and so forth. The historian Rudolf Rommel is estimating that in 20th century socialism, basically Russia and Soviet Union, 61 million people died or executed, 78 million in China, and roughly 200 million worldwide. And some of these were victims of obviously famines, collectivization, cultural revolution, purges, campaign against unearned income. These are, again, capital unearned income, and other devilish experiment in social engineering. So all these experiments you see in universities, minimum wage, minimum subsistence to give free to everybody, all these things have been already experimented. And the result has been disastrous with bloodshed. So this is the monstrosity of terror unveiled in the course of human history. So Lenin coup in 1917, which basically overthrew the provincial government, opened new stage in human history and a regime of public slavery, collectivist economic planning led by coercion, violence, and mass murder. Marx and Engels had defined socialism as the abolition of private property. The most fundamental component of private property, self-ownership, was abolished. So these are the key elements. Now we'll see how Americans experimented with this.
Americans didn't invent free market capitalism, but you might say they perfected it. In doing so, they created more wealth for more people than any society in the history of the world. To begin to understand this fascinating and complex story, we have to travel back in time to the very first settlers of America. But before we get to the history, let me define what I mean by capitalism. It's not an easy term to pin down because it developed over thousands of years of human interaction. Adam Smith, the great English thinker, first described it in his famous 1776 treatise, The Wealth of Nations, but he didn't invent it. For our purposes here, I define capitalism as an economic system in which individuals freely decide what they will produce and who they will serve. Since both parties have to consent, it's a system in which success demands that you serve the needs of others before you are rewarded for your work. Now back to history. When the first settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607, then Plymouth in 1620, they were operating under an economic system common to all European nations at that time, known as mercantilism. Under mercantilism, businesses, especially in the colonies, were operated for the benefit of the state. While governments permitted the companies to make profits, their primary purpose was to advance the national interest of England or Spain or France. The early American settlements were set up to be self-sufficient, so that the English government didn't have to support them, and they had to stake out territory. That was key to the colonial game. If England held the territory, Spain and France didn't. The early colonists began their adventure with what they thought was a beautiful idea. They set up a common storehouse of grain from which people were supposed to take what they needed and put back what they could. Lands were also held in common and were worked in common. The settlers owned no land of their own. Though there was no name for this system, it was an ideal socialist commune. And you can probably guess what happened. it began to fall apart almost immediately. As the colonists learned, when everyone is entitled to everything, no one's responsible for anything. A colonist who started his workday early or stayed late received the same provision of food as a colonist who showed up late, went home early, or didn't work at all. After about 2 years, the settlement was reduced to eating shoelaces and rats. Half of them died of starvation. Captain John Smith, of Pocahontas fame, took control of the colony and scrapped the socialist model. Each colonist received his own parcel of land. Private property had come to the New World. He who won't work won't eat, Smith told them, citing the biblical admonition. Well, they worked, and they ate, and the colony was saved. The same story unfolded further north, in the Plymouth colony 10 years later. Although this was a Puritan colony with religious goals, its plan was the same as Jamestown's, and it also failed. As its young governor, William Bradford, noted, by adopting the communal system, we thought we were wiser than God. So they quickly abandoned the commune for private ownership. Soon they had an abundance, which they celebrated with a holiday we now know as Thanksgiving. Over the next 150 years, this hard-learned lesson that men should be responsible for their own economic fate became conventional wisdom in the colonies. The American Revolution was largely fought over the burden that British mercantilism placed on the colonies. Two unpopular taxes, the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, are well-known examples. The Americans saw the British government regulating and controlling almost all of their economic activities and didn't like it. Now, it's true that even after gaining independence, none of the founders could be called capitalists. The idea of capitalism as a description of an economic system was only just beginning to be discussed in America. Yet many of the most influential founders intuitively gravitated toward free market principles. Thomas Jefferson's ideas of private land ownership shaped the famous Land Ordinance of 1785 that made public land available to private citizens, while Alexander Hamilton's concepts of individual responsibility and sanctity of contracts could be seen in the Panic of 1791-92, in which he steadfastly refused to allow the U.S. government to bail out bankers who had triggered the panic. Benjamin Franklin, of course, had practiced capitalism all his life with his printing business and with his maxims in Poor Richard's Almanac. The Constitution itself is awash in core concepts of a free market, sanctity of contracts, freedom of expression, powerful limits on the government's ability to regulate or tax, and emphasis on paying debts, and so on. In short, it was the wisdom of experience, not academic ideology, that created America's free market principles. The result has been the most prosperous and free nation in the history of the world.
Okay, I think we got a good recent message of how we got to this point. Now, there are Baha'i references to socioeconomic systems. Baha'i system is a worldwide federated national system governed by an international body elected by each country looking holistically view of the planet as a united, integrated humanity, free from all prejudices, including nationalism, ethnic, race, etc. Promotes private ownership of free market and cooperation of member states versus brutal competition in capitalism. Eradication of war and militarism, free movement of goods and services, production of goods and services where it is most cost effective anywhere in the world, protecting the environment, elimination of forced labor or slavery of any kind, elimination of extreme wealth and poverty, eradication of diseases, elimination of child labor, equality of man and woman, equalitarian system in the eyes of the law, freedom of speech, promoter of individual rights, and which, by the way, finally passed United Nations in 1948, which was, remember, this idea of individual rights came in 1844 by Baha'i philosophy. Eventually, world is moving toward this ideology, but albeit very slowly. So if you look at these, you have contrast between socialism and pure capitalism, and none of them truly exist today. true capitalism or true socialism. But if you look the contrast, the free market versus regulated market, private enterprise versus state enterprise, private means of production versus state-run, cooperation of labor and capital, where both against both socialism and capitalism are not aligned with it. Distribution of wealth, which is elimination of poverty through charity and philanthropy, where one is says distribution of wealth by force, the other one is unregulated, wherever the capital generates more money. So this is the contrast that we can see. Progressive taxation versus reduction of taxation, a planned economy versus open economy. Both socialists and capitalists neglect the environment, where Baha'i doctrine promotes integrated development and environmental protection, state ownership, which of education, healthcare, and employment, which is eventually is going to be rationed, which it is rationed. And in the right side and capitalism, they say purely individuals live and die by their abilities. And it's not responsibility of state to take care of them. But in Baha'i religion, state would pay for education if the family cannot afford it, or healthcare. But the caveat is that if the individual cannot provide healthcare and education. So let's look at the democratic parties. It was basically one of the oldest political systems that existed. It came from Jeffersonian time, known as the Party of Common Man. The crisis of Democratic Party came around 1850, where the Democrats of the South increasingly rejected national policies and demanded basically to promote slavery and legalize slavery that existed in the South applied to the North. And what ended up happening is that, of course, they were the largest political party at the time, and they wanted to go take over I believe, Cuba, and then create a slavery market in Kansas, and so on and so forth. Now, what happened was that obviously Republican Party formed at the same time when people were migrating that were against slavery. So that's really where Republican Party became basically was formed. Now, interestingly, when the war started between North and South, and obviously the slavery proponents were defeated, a group of Southern Democrat and former Confederate veterans founded the Ku Klux Klan. The reason I'm mentioning this is that you see the notion of race relations today, which I'll explain later on, which is really not real, and it's fabricated by politicians in general to further their own agenda. So the Ku Klux Klan started basically in 1870s, and they were grabbing most of the Democratic elected individuals in Congress, and they promoted terrorism and establishment of white supremacy, basically, and so on. And they were against Catholics, Jews, African Americans, and organized labor. The peak of the Ku Klux Klan actually was 1920, that they had 4 million people adherents nationwide. Now let's look at the today's political position of the Democratic Party. They're basically promoting social programs, labor unions, consumer protection, workplace safety regulation, equal opportunity, disability rights, racial equality, regulation against environmental pollution, criminal justice reform. They support abortion rights, LGBT community, and again, pathway of citizenship of undocumented immigrants. Typically, they agree with the scientific census of climate change and multilateral approach in foreign policy. But remember, all these things are utopic type of needs that everybody would agree to. The problem is that the objective path of achieving it is not presented. So how about the Republican parties? The Republican Party is sometimes called GOP, Grand Old Party, is one of the world's oldest extant political parties. And they're basically oppose the Democratic Party. They emerged from in 1854, combating that slavery doctrine of the South, and basically was formed by businessmen, Protestants, evangelicals, professionals, factory workers, and prosperous farmers, and former black slaves that and some white Southerners, especially in the mountain areas. These are still the stronghold of the Republican Party in the South. They were pro-business, pro-bank and gold standard and railroad, and they wanted tariffs so foreign countries would not flood their markets. They were opposed to expansion of slavery. The political position of the Republicans in United States is based on American conservatism, in contrast to obviously social liberalism. The parties consist of moderates, sometimes described as establishment Republican, members of Tea Party and Freedom Caucus, again, populist, right-wing, and far-right as well. The party also incorporates several other factions like libertarian Republicans who advocate libertarian policies. This is basically government not meddling to any of the citizens' activities. Although the Republican Party evolved as far as their economic and socioeconomic agendas, but the conservatism still is the main goal or main objective of the Republican Party. And they're obviously, they want to restrict labor unions, they want gun rights, the traditional values or ethics, or they claim to be ethical. Often it's has Christian foundation, restriction on abortion, lavish military spending, unilateral action in foreign policies. They're anti-communist in general, and obviously their belief in restricting immigration and opposing drug legalization, and of course pro-school choice. Now, the big battle is really between conglomerate of left and right versus people and medium to small businesses. And what tools do they use, these big conglomerates? So it's not the issue of left against right, which it appears, and they make people believe that they're people are divided between Democrats and Republicans, and now the whole country is divided. In reality, the battle is between the big corporations, conglomerate, both on the left and right, versus the medium, small companies and people that serve them in general. What are the instruments of this battle is regulation, taxes, deficit spending, tariffs, political influence through lobbying, direct contribution through political PACs. Now, what happened last 4 years, again, taxes, these are the two major aspects. And we'll see how Democrats, for example, massively increased the regulations during the Obama administration without even passing it through the Congress. And they used loopholes to do it. And of course, when the pendulum swung toward the right, they killed all of them. It's amazing of the battle that is going on. Now, when you're looking at the departure of ethics from US society, this battle actually, it becomes now more visible that both parties use any tool in their means, whether it's facts or fiction or falsities that they create or movement to battle each other. So the big international corporations that are basically puppet masters are two types. One, they're the ones that are actually mostly business to consumer oriented. That means that, and most of them don't pay any taxes, barely. And they're very afraid of antitrust laws to force them to split, because they control their duopolies or near monopolies, and they control basically markets completely. And they portray themselves as champion of the common man, and very sensitive to consumer opinion. Usually they are left-leaning organization promoting Democratic Party in general. Who are they? They're Amazons, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, processed food companies like Kraft, beverage companies, personal care companies, media companies, Hollywood, and etc. So you see this divide is corporate-based, not people-based. So how do they do this? Is through regulation, taxes, deficit spending, social program helps them to profit from consumerism to the detriment of society and a small business. So they don't really care about people. They want to sell their goods, and they agree to whoever is in power and whatever means they can use to basically please them. And they look at people as cash machines, basically. So the other side is people that are the conglomerates that are business to business normally. That means that these are large near monopolies as well that promote free market, less traffic, lower taxes, deregulation. They don't care about the environment and so on and so forth. And they usually lean toward right. And these are Republican ideology, financial deregulation, abolishing environmental laws, help them to maximize profit at the detriment of people and environment. And of course, small companies as well. Who are they? ExxonMobil, Bank America, Deutsche Bank, Coke Industries, GE, agricultural manufacturing, Boeing, and so on. Now, who are these majority of silent majority that is being squeezed by these conglomerates and through the use of politics? These are medium and small companies, usually 1,000 employees or less, and they promote open market, lower taxes, lower regulation, access to market. They're usually service companies. Clinics, restaurants, small manufacturers, personal service companies, software companies, biotech startups, construction companies, technology entrepreneurs, retailers, car dealers, and service and repair, and so on. So you see the contrast that who is the bulk of the silent majority. And they're environmentally conscious, politically moderate, true champion of the people. Their existence are tied to the best service, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and they're the main engine of the growth in the job market and economy. They are in constant competition with big conglomerate and big business with limited access to capital and cost of money. They want the government to stay out of their business. They are mostly conservative, leaning to a Republican Party ideology. Now, how does these conglomerate control the process, drive the politics? It's through special interest group and lobby group. And the lobby groups are three kinds. They're animal rights group, environmental group, like Greenpeace. You have public interest groups, and then you have underpaid professional workers groups, like American Bar Association. Of course, this is an anecdote. Doctors belong to American Medical Association, and of course, teachers, National Education Society, and labor unions like AFL-CIO and Teamster. So the most common type of interest group is formed around businesses, corporation, and trade association. Part of the reputation for power is based on the fact that they represent about half of all interest groups in Washington. They influence other interest group through direct tax-deductible donations. So that's how they control the lobby and interest group. How do they work? They send representatives to Washington, D.C., lobbying the Congress people, generally. So now we're coming to these large corporations that they're puppet masters, conglomerates versus the people and small business. So through a special lobby interest group, they control legislation. Through political PACs donation, they control politicians. Through advertising dollar, they control media, which are mostly media is leaning toward left. And the reason is not because they like it, it's because majority of business to consumers that spend advertising are left. So they have to adhere to them to attract their basically advertising dollars. That to covert funding, they create and fuel social movement. Through promotion of regulation, they stifle competition against small and medium companies, the main engine of employment. Through taxation, they weaken formation of capital against smaller companies that have limited access to capital and cannot use tax loopholes. Nearly 100 of Fortune 500, these are multi-billion-dollar companies. 100 of them paid no tax, federal tax, in 2018. So this is the process. The conglomerate capitalists, through sponsorship of Congress, they pass these laws. There are different types of special groups, and of course, they have media, they bought the media, and then they push this legislation through Congress people. And of course, Senate, and it finally goes to the president to sign, generally. Now, when they look at the influence of these big conglomerates, they looked at it from a government perspective. The agenda definitions influencing the direct implementation basically is controlled by these groups. And these are studies that were done. For example, 54.8% of all significant legislation enactment was done by these special interest groups. 41% was significant executive orders. The significant administrative agency rules, close to 40%. 37% was significant judicial decision, was influenced. So policy historian does credit interest group factor with playing a role in policy making in every type of federal policy making venue, but most often in Congress. Interest group activities are sometimes mentioned as the sole explanatory factor in these explanations. If you look at these basically legislation, they're a couple of inches thick. A congressman that has handful of staff cannot produce these legislation. It's designed, produced, and at best, the congressman can tweak it, of course, with getting donation toward his election, next year election coffer. But in reality, the actual legislation is drafted by these interest groups, not by Congress people. Now, is really political, US political system divided between Republicans and that are leaning liberal, or I'm sorry, Republicans that are conservatives and liberals that are democratic? In really, if you look at it, primary goal of large corporation is to increase their valuation and profit. They don't care about left or right. And these guys fund any member of Congress as long as they pursue their goal, which is generating profit for themselves. So they want these regulations to protect their turf and market shares. So they, on the surface, again, they're very liberal and progressive, and but in reality, they increase the cost of goods and stifle innovation. And against, of course, startups and small companies in general. The small companies are really the engine of production of labor. So this basically, as we mentioned, these monopolies, for example, Amazon, when you're looking at, and they're mostly business to consumer type of organization. And obviously Amazon is a near monopoly in the market, similar to, for example, Microsoft is near monopoly in their environment. And what happens in general, they use the information internally to stifle and destroy the small businesses. A good example of it is Google, although it appears, the Amazon appears to be open market, anyone can compete there. But in reality, they use artificial intelligence and statistics of which products are the most dominant in their segment of the market. They would replicate it with another manufacturer, and they promote the hell out of it and basically destroy the smaller businesses. And this is not seen by the consumer, and because they spend so much money promoting left and left of center ideology, people think that they're promoting, they're good for people. And in reality, they're not. And this is really what people need to know. The big, same thing with the, on the right side, the conglomerates, they don't care about the environment, like chemical companies, Koch brothers, oil companies, and of course, the reality doesn't change that the people and small businesses are subject to brunt of their mishap. So what is the principle of socialism and Baha'i refutation of the socialism in general. The principles of socialism are outstripped in religion of God. For instance, God commands, but they prefer them to themselves, although there be indigence among them. And this is quote from Quran. That is, the believers spend of their substance and share their possessions and prefer others to themselves willingly and with utmost spirituality. Socialists, however, desire to enforce equality and association by compulsion, although the preference for others, which is the exhortation of God, is more difficult because the rich are enjoined to prefer others to themselves. This will become common and will be the cause of tranquility and aid to the order of the world, because it depends upon the inclination and willingness of the giver. But socialism and egalitarianism, although easier, and as those who are made equal with others, yet such a system will not become widespread and is the cause of disturbance and tumult, because it rests on compulsion and coercion. And we saw, and this came in 1800s, and they predicted, Baha'i religion predicted the disastrous outcome of application of socialism in general. Okay, now we're going to go back to an example when left and right and deregulation caused a collapse of the banking system. There was a well-known law that was passed to create affordable housing for low-income people in 1970s in terms of ability for veterans and low-income people to be able to buy a house. And they were called Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae later on. And because of the mishap of deregulation, eventually in 2008, the Federal Housing Finance Agency took it over. This was a semi-governmental agency, which was, I think, 49% government and 51% public, that was guaranteeing those loans in the secondary market. So guess what happened with this deregulation that occurred in 1999? Now, what happened is that the banking system the regulation that was developed in 1933 after the Great Depression was abolished, basically. And the lobbyists, bank lobbyists, they said they cannot compete with large foreign firms if they're not allowed to meddle into secondary market or basically international endeavors as far as the financial instruments are concerned. But they promised they're going to use it for low-risk securities and using deposits of their depositors, the money of their depositor, and they're very going to be frugal and use it in low-risk securities. So the deregulation allowed the banks to engage into hedge fund, derivatives, and mortgage to support that, because only 10% of their total money comes from bank investors. The rest are borrowed from the central bank generally. So to prop up their ability to basically grow, they had to issue mortgages. And these mortgages, we all know what happened to them. Majority of them were subprime, and they even created interest-only loans in real estate for housing. So generally what happened is that they bundled the subprime mortgages and sold them as a safe AA rated prime investment. and causing near collapse of many foreign banks and sovereign wealth funds, bringing the global banking system to near collapse. But in 2004, Federal Reserve raised the Fed funds rate to the banks. That means that free money was stopped, and the interest rate started to rise for the mortgage, and the short-term loans, 5-year loans, became due, and the bubble of housing that was created imploded in 2007. So what ended up happening is that the owner, which was a university student that had 3 or 4 houses, by easy money and fictitious document of their assets, caused this collapse. And of course, the real estate people were involved, the banks were involved, the grading companies were involved. Everybody was, they had their hands into the cookie jar, and they created the recession of the 2008. And ironically, the last couple of years, Republican and Democrat knew that it's going to collapse. But when Bush attempted to stop the hemorrhage, neither Congress were interested. So whatever they were trying to do was too little too late. Now, the rise of populism and election of conservative populists. You know, collapse of banking system in 2008 and recession that caused receivership of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae was blamed on Republicans. So ironically, the next 8 years, the politics fell into the Democratic hands for the next 8 years of Obama administration. His policies were moved toward globalism, international consensus building, portraying a civil and gentle America, apologetic of American past interference in other countries' political systems, participating in global warming movement, which brunt of the cost was borne by the advanced economies, reduction of defense, US presence in the world arena, and of course, the outcome was disastrous. Outcome for entire world, and saw US as declining superpower, and rogue nation like Iran created turmoil and sectarian war in the Middle East and North Africa, promoting religious expansionism, byproduct of pacifist and non-interference policy of American administration. So let's see how did he do it? Because these majority of these laws couldn't even pass Congress. So his domestic policy was massive injection of liquidity in the market, bailing out the banks, massive expansion of food stamp, massive expansion of unemployment coverage, providing grant to education for unemployed workers, expansion of food stamps. So generally, the deficit during this period almost doubled. So he used the Affordable Care Act, which was increased the premiums almost 97%. Of course, it engaged a lot more people had insurance after the law. But the revenues of the insurance companies increased actually. So this didn't impact the global, those conglomerates of insurance companies were having a field day as well. But the brunt of this was borne by obviously people, small businesses, and deficit. And of course, DACA as well. Now, how he did it, which is interesting. The first 2 years that they controlled, Democrats controlled the Congress and presidency, they could pass those laws. From then on, the next 6 years, he used executive order. During his presidency, he had 1,461 executive order. So all the left-leaning agendas were signed into law by him bypassing Congress. Where you look at the Trump administration, executive order was only 177 in 4 years, or Bush era was 291 in 8 years. So that's how he did it. Now, cutting defense budget, massive expansion of government size, massive increase of regulation, tax rate, expansion of IRS, chasing medium-sized corporations. So these policies increased the national debt from 9 trillion to 19 trillion. Of course, our children are going to pay for this. Ironically, it hollowed the economy by creating low-paying service jobs, flight of manufacturing to other countries, generous trade partners, promoting globalism, stagnation of US workers' income, flight of capital, stagnation of business formation, creating jobs. But they were certain that they're gonna win. This is interesting. They're gonna win. And the reason was that they had 46 million people on food stamps, increasing the size of government, strengthening unions, having easy monetary policy, massive subsidies, promotion of green energy, global warming movement, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, they were right. Their ideology won the popular vote, but they lost the presidency to a populist at the end. So the Republican primary was interesting. There was a bunch of groups of basically individual, brash and a brash billionaire. The rest were lawmakers, and they battled each other. And finally, because the billionaire businessman didn't have any experience, so nobody could attack him on his track record. So that's how he was detecting the problems that were caused by the Democrats and politicians in general last 8 years, and presenting that he has a solution for those. And that's really why he became elected. The Democratic Party forgot about common man and was betrayed by the people. Basically were betrayed by both Republican and Democratic parties. And Trump detected this phenomenon, and they promised stagnation of wages of last 40 years is going to be corrected. And now people would see economy grew by maybe last 4 years by 7 or 8%. But before, when economy grew, people didn't benefit from it. But during his administration, it did. So during this, and that's how he got elected, backlash in terms of Obama regulation and policies in general. Even the Democrat didn't accept him as president. So they used FBI and Department of Justice and remnant of assignees of Obama were fighting Trump administration for last 4 years. It's quite interesting, and there is slowly these inadequacies and meddling of the government agencies into politics is coming to light right now. Even traditional Republican politicians were against his policies also, because he mainly attacks large organizations and conglomerates. That's why large, basically Republicans, traditional Republicans or Democrats don't like him at all. Now, midterm elections, these conglomerates infused a lot of cash into the Democratic Party elections and took the Congress back, basically, through these special groups and spending massive amount of money on local elections. So Now we're going to go to today's presidential election, and I just want to clarify something so we don't get mixed into politics of how these elections are conducted. First of all, there is a new science called artificial intelligence and machine learning language that is in disposal of both Republican and basically Democratic parties. The way it works is that they take the history of all elections with all the variables, and then they plug in the element of variables within this model to predict whether their representative is going to win the election or not. So this is a really scientific method that they do this. And the formula is binary. That means, is incumbent president get reelected or not? So it's a binary, yes or no, right? Now, I give you an example of how banks use this artificial intelligence. It's a very simple process, and I explain one of them. Like, the banker sits and say, it looks at the data of all the loans that they have given. They look at it and find out that if the loan to salary of the person is 3 times higher, then there is a 90% chance that they can pay the loan. Otherwise, they would default. That means that if the loan is more than 3 times the salary of the person, there's 90% chance of defaulting. And if it's less than 3 times the salary, there's 90% chance of basically them paying it back. So what do? They create policies, again, yes or no, to loan to this person or not to loan. And you see the false positive or false negative is only 10%. So this is, you see how the bankers do on one variable. Now in the election process, the variable is many. And the way this machine language works, they run millions and millions of runs with chasing basically different variables. And each variable has a multiplier. That means effectiveness of that variable into the election result. So what ends up happening, so you have economy, unemployment, voter turnout, party primary, approval rate, advertising, base turnout, religious groups, other variables like race relation, riots, security, war, deficit, law and order, poverty rate, populist movements, inflation, misery index, and so on. So you see, I give you one example of this economy. So they plug in at, if the last 4 years economy growth is more than 8%, there's 90% chance of the incumbent winning. So they plug this into did economy grew more than 8%? Yes. So then they plug it into the formula of the election result. The same thing with unemployment. Did unemployment drop? Did unemployment get higher? And voter turnout, same thing. And around this, look at the race relation or riots. These are factors in this model. Unfortunately, these models are being used by the Democrats, and then they decided that they can influence the election result through these variables. So what is the result? The result is they pick movements that maybe it's obscure or very sidelines, and then they resurrect them. So let's look at the Black Lives Matter, a socialist movement, and their logo is defund the police. Is it a social movement or a political election tool? If you look at the chart that was published by one of the universities, you'll see there is no blacks in these movements. It's 76% Caucasian in Atlanta, 78% Caucasian in Los Angeles, 85% all these riots and so on, is Caucasian in Minneapolis. 76% is Caucasian in New York. So this is not a socialist movement that is basically sanctioned by people. This is an election variable. That's all it is. Now, what is the real movement? This is the real movement. Look at this picture and tell me, what do you see? This is Civil Rights Movement March. What do you see? Obviously, majority are blacks, right? So do you see the contrast between a real movement and a fictitious one? So what is the conclusion? Conclusion is bringing back ethics into business and politics. Among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is that religious, racial, political, economic, and patriotic prejudices destroy the edifice of humanity. As long as these prejudices prevail, the world of humanity will not have rest. So stay away from politics, stay away from political motivated movement, stay away from socialism, be independent and be happy. Thank you very much. Any questions for me? John?
That was a lot of information indeed. Thank you. So a question that I really need to ask, as it was asked practically first, this question is from Alex from Nebraska. I'm going to pull this up and hopefully we can have your answer on this. So, oh my God, I'm scrolling through that. You got a lot of questions.
I apologize if stepping on anybody's foot or ideology. This wasn't my intention. It's just factual element that people need to know.
So here's the question. So one thing he's been wondering about lately in relation to the topic is the idea of universal basic income. This is what he says. I've been hearing a lot of praise for it lately. Supporters of the idea talk about how when everyone has a basic income, they can meet their needs, then they're free to pursue jobs that truly interest them, ones that typically aren't considered real jobs. Since they rarely provide enough income or stable income, or their value to society is belittled. Furthermore, people will be able to undertake entrepreneurial endeavors without worrying about paying their rent, their mortgage, or putting food on the table. In other words, pretty much he's asking about universal income, universal basic income, and how if we were to adopt it, it would allow people to do more with their time to benefit humanity.
Well, again, this is it's a socialist ideology that is proven false generally. So this is not something new, as you saw during the early settlers. They tried it. See, they said, come and pick anything you want from the storeroom, and guess what? They all starved to death. So we tried this already. So why go back to it? This is from a basic human activity perspective. If you're not responsible for your own well-being and you're fed, this is what end up happening. We already tried it. It's not something new. Ironically, it's nice to the ear if you had unlimited resources and somebody else was producing it. So that's the key element from that perspective. But from a religious perspective, in Baha'i religion, is prohibited, actually. It's called su'al, means begging. That means you have been donated money without any work. This is prohibited in Baha'i religion. You're not allowed to receive money without performing work for it. Whether you're a monk in a mountain seclusion, those type of practices is forbidden in Baha'i religion, which is the latest revelation of God. I hope I answered it.
So is there an example from the past that, other than America, you can pull from that would elaborate more this subject about people effectively?
Oh, of course, 1974, city of New York went bankrupt. And the reason was that they instituted with a socialist, basically administration in city of New York, they gave $400 per child to every citizen of New York. And what ended up happening, it promoted basically having children out of wedlock.
Wait, $400 per child per month?
Per month.
Per year? Per month.
Right. So what ended up happening is that people had tax-free, by the way, tax-free. So I was an engineer in 78 when this collapse occurred. I was making about $30,000. A lady in Harlem with 6 kids was making close to about 24,000 tax-free, equivalent of $35,000 plus free food stamp plus free housing. So for her to, she was making more money than an engineer that worked 8 years to get a degree. So what was the result? Did they contribute freely to the society because they were paid? No, it promoted promiscuity, having children out of wedlock. They destroyed the base of blacks in New York City with these policies.
So a question that was asked by Yvette, she's asking regarding the sources that we're using for the statistics. Is there a place someone can go to find sources on their own to see what you're talking about independently?
Sure, Wikipedia has all of it. You mean the statistics I showed on the?
Yes.
Okay, yes, there's statistics there. I didn't invent any of it.
So anyone who goes to Wikipedia, they take a look at the sources that are cited. On the bottom, there's the references. And then those references on the bottom of the Wikipedia page, if you click on it, it'll
remember, this is, the Wikipedia is the most advanced and accurate source of information. And you can get it there. It's really good. You can change something that is false in matter of minutes. People would replace it.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of teachers who may be watching right now may say this is bad to tell your children, because when I was growing up, Wikipedia was new. Everyone would use Wikipedia papers instead of doing their homework.
Right. No, it's a good thing. And by the way, whether left or right wins, the discretionary expenditure of the presidency is only 5%. It's not, they can't just tilt it all the way to the left or to the right. The problem is that they collude. That's the problem. The left and right collude, and they rob the taxpayer. That's the problem.
So the question that several people have asked is, why talk about these movements, either the left or the right? What is the contribution that the Baha'i message has to this problem that you're describing or alluding to?
It's ethics. The Baha'is are trying to make Christians adhere to Jesus's message. We're not trying to change them. They've taken ethics out of education, ethics out of politics, ethics out of entertainment, ethics out of songs, ethics out of schools, you name it. Ethics out of military. We're trying to push them back to become a Christian.
So for people who are not Christian or people who don't right now believe in a God, what do you mean by ethics beyond that? What do you mean by ethics?
We described the individual rights. Remember the first slide that I showed you, the tenet of revelation of mid-1800s, a Baha'i religion, which is slowly is getting adopted. It was only 1908, which Dr. Wright took to Congress regarding abolition of child labor. Prior to that, 5-6-year-olds were going to factories or farms and working. Guess what? In mid-1800, Baha'i religion prohibited parents and government to take children out of school and put them to work. So it took close to 60 years before those messages got into the system, or same thing for women's right, for example. Toward mid-1800, this equality of man and woman, which was promoted and exercised, not talked about, exercised by Baha'i administration and Baha'i adherents in mid-1800s, it was only 100 years that women could vote in this country. Only 100 years. Imagine in mid-1800, women could vote, they could divorce their husband, they could travel with their permission. So these are the key elements of revelation that is seeping into the society, Western society. Ironically, majority of them think they invented it. That's the funny part.
So you're saying that the source of all these social movements that have been to liberate the people has been, you're claiming, from the Baha'i message, right?
Of course, it's written, it's there, and it's dated. So you can go to Baha'i books and you can see when it was published.
So there's a question here from Chance that was asked towards the beginning of your talk. And this question had to do with the Baha'i values that he found relates to what you're talking about. So he asked, based off of this quote, he asked that, this quote, the most despised of men in the sight of God are those who sit idly and beg. Hold ye fast unto the cord of material means, placing your whole trust in God, the provider of all means. When anyone occupieth himself in the craft or trade, such occupation itself is regarded in the estimation of God as an act of worship, and this is not but a token of his infinite and all-pervasive bounty. And then he also provided this other quote that the most despised in the sight of God are those that don't work. So his question is, where the faith says that, in the sight of God, all people should work. And also Baha'is are called clearly to help the poor. Baha'is are supposed to be where the poor is God's trust in our midst, where he tells literally the rich ones of earth that the poor are God's trust in our midst. How do we reconcile these two seemingly different perspectives?
Oh, it's very, very clear. First of all, there are two classes of people. People that cannot work because of disability. That means that they cannot provide means of sustenance for themselves. That's the job of the government, to create that safety net so they can survive, and this is where the poor are. The orphans, let's say people that lost their breadwinners and so on and so forth, and they don't have means of surviving. But this is different than, even to the point that government is mandated to provide jobs for people that can work. And the key here is can work. But this differentiation is very clear.
So how would the Baha'i faith in the Baha'i model come in, where you have this capitalist and the socialist models that we've described? How would it come in and fix this problem? How would someone practically see this happen?
Well, generally, the Baha'i economic system has to be developed. It's in its infancy. The real source of capital and interest to the capital is part of the major departure from the prior manifestation of Islamic doctrine that was prohibited, for example, interest or basically use of this kind of capitalistic model. But in reality, this free market, remember, the model itself has to be international governance, of course, with local state governments in place as well. But the key is abolition of war, abolition of the expenditure on defense generates enough capital that you can make and eliminate disease, eliminate poverty, but source of it is capital. Source of it is use of capital. And this is really the model that will be developed. For example, a good example of it is sharing of the profit of the company with the employees of the company, which many companies in Western societies do. So there are a lot of these idiosyncrasies that is mentioned. And like during famine, Abdul Baha mentioned that he created grain reserves for 7 years. When war came to Palestine, he was the only source of providing food for the poor and starved. And he prevented massive starvation that was about to occur in Palestine by redistributing all those grains that were stored for that time. So these concepts already exist in Baha'i religion in terms of an insurance, basically.
You're bringing an interesting issue, though. So where you talked about the example where Abdul Baha fed the masses with grain that was stored, and this is World War I, when a blockade was formed around Palestine, which was then the Ottoman Empire by the British. The British used that as a tool to starve out the country so they can obviously win the war, World War I. The problem that comes about from this context, though, is that it wasn't just Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha told people to do this. There were a lot of farmers involved in Adessia.
Baha'i farmers, by the way, and they were in Jordan.
So how big was this? How extensive was this, and what does it take for similar issues like this, where Abdul Baha had clearly made a huge impact? How does this happen in other circumstances?
Well, remember the supporting houses of justice in different countries are designed to take the basically excess money of the profits and use it for this kind of purposes. So there are direct sort of voluntary and mandatory taxation that allows the not-for-profit organization to distribute the work, basically donation to people that need them, or apply it where it's necessary. But this Christianity and Christian churches are a lot more effective in terms of basically creating food kitchens and distribution of food through donation than the government do. A lot of, even for example, Medicaid administration, cost of administrating Medicaid in large cities are more than the actual food that they distribute, because government is doing it instead of religious organization. These things have been proven over and over again.
So the difficulty that people have, it seems, it is the distribution of the supplies to those who are without those supplies. How is it that you propose from the Baha'i writings and the Baha'i solution, how do you suppose that this would be implemented realistically, where you don't have people, for example, who believe in Jesus Christ to go to a church and be a part of the congregation, or people who believe in a religion, period? How do you propose meeting the needs of a society that is, well, as we're calling it, and we've described it, pretty broken? How do you propose fixing it?
Well, remember, the soup kitchens don't ask what your religion is when the person comes in. So this is really, it's a method, a model that works, and works perfectly, because people see them as honest. When they do donation, it gets to the end user. Majority of actually not-for-profit philanthropic movement, better than 90% of the donation they get is spent on advertising, or people pay themselves, or have jets flying all over the place, which is fraudulent. Majority of the religious that directly distributes to people are the legitimate ones. And this is statistics that is available, and everybody can see it. We actually were monitoring them because we provided a online contribution system for any organization free of charge, radio station, churches, and so on and so forth. And we studied not-for-profit organization. Majority of them are actually shell companies that is designed to rob people. It's unfortunate, but that's reality. But churches are religious organizations are most effective in terms of making sure people don't go hungry. It's ridiculous to, in the United States, with the wealth that we have, anyone going hungry here. We throw 30% of our food out into the garbage can. And we have people that are hungry. So it's a distribution problem. It's not a basically cost or funding problem.
So a person asked this question, do you see any parallels between today's growing economic inequality that may cause public sentiment towards these socialist policies, the same way that we had a century earlier in America, particularly with the progressive era and the Gilded Age, as Mark Twain coined it?
Well, remember, the problem is that if the left and right, any one of them that come to power would push their agenda and bribe the other side in terms of deficit spending, what end up happening, you're gonna reach a tipping point. And tipping point, right now we are in that trajectory of collapse of economic system. And we don't have any way of solving it because politicians left ethics at home when they come out of their house. So this is where the trajectory is. The question is that how do you make politicians ethical? I have no idea. So but the trajectory is there. Now, when the collapse occurs, then that socialism movement becomes foot, because they see no choice but feeding people and redoing the financial systems. But there are ways to prevent that. Right now, all the basically Medicare, Medicaid, the Social Security, pension plans of cities, they're all in bankruptcy or will go into bankruptcy within the next 10, 20 years. So we are moving toward that direction very rapidly. And this is what we need to be cognizant to make sure we don't elect individuals that are spending unrestricted on nice things that sounds good, that would contribute to that collapse, which is going to be down the road. But I'm sure the pendulum would come back, and eventually people realize. Right now, I don't see it with this polarization of politics. Eventually, the middle America would rise and try to bring us back. But reality doesn't change, and this is where we are.
All right, I have a question from Regina Colston. I asked people who have their questions if they want to ask themselves. So we're gonna unmute her and she can ask her question.
Thank you, Dr. Hakim. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you again about the Black Lives Matter. You raised the point that they had a large white membership. If you look at the protests, young white people have taken on the mantle to fight against oppression. Can you not see that movement had evolved to be inclusive of whites and other peoples of color? Remember, the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King was built upon what Gandhi did in India and on other movements within the Black community, including John Brown and the abolitionist movement.
Of course. Excellent question. Actually, I'm glad to be able to respond to that. The insinuation wasn't this, that the life of Blacks does not matter. This is not the case. The organization itself is a socialist government, a socialist movement, which is far, far left. They actually have a video themselves that they say, we are Marxist. We're trained in Marxist organizations. They're, ironically, to tell you the truth, so no one is against Black Lives Matter, but this had nothing to do with the organization or that they created. Ironically, even Black Lives Matter is in a lawsuit with the mirror company that Soros created. Soros created Black Lives Matter Global, an organization which has a massive amount of money, about $70 million, and advertise Black Lives Matter, which has nothing to do with the original group. And what he does is that he takes donation and funnel it to hundreds of millions of dollars, funnels it to the Democratic National Committee. So as you see, even the name is hijacked already by Soros and his groups. And they're raising money, giving it to, this is, why don't you look at the Wikipedia? They describe actually, and there's a lawsuit between Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter Global, which is doing all the advertising and funding all these movements. It's not done by the Black Lives Matter. Blacks are against defunding the police because it harms them. That's why they don't participate in these movements, because it harms them. Abortion harms Black community. That's why they don't participate. It's not that everybody is for Black Lives Matter. There is no, ironically, it's interesting, actually, a lady that was, it was in mid-30s, that had a panel of all lives matter, and he was promoting, she was killed. Do you see that anywhere in the news? You don't see it. Why? Because the advertisers and media companies, this goes against the trend of what they want people to believe. Therefore, they not present it. But remember, all these in 60s, give you an example. In 60s, the Black community's family unit was stronger than whites. In early 70s, when liberal took over, they promoted abortion, they promoted free money, they corrupted the inner cities, and what ended up happening is it started to dismantle the Black family. And now we see the result of it. But it's the issue of the religious doctrine that the Democratic Party and socialist movements are against. The minute you take God out of it, whether it's education, whether it's family, whether it's whatever, military, you look at media, if you take ethics out of it, it's going to destroy itself. Baha'u'llah actually is mentioned. The time comes with prostitution of media occurs, prostitution of basically politics. All these things, prostitution of arts. These are all prophesied within Baha'i religion. And this is the ill of the society. Now, the question is that and this is what they're saying, is American society prejudiced? If you have lived anywhere else in the world except America, you would know this is the least prejudiced country on earth. The problem really is that, as I said before, so the unfortunate thing is that these race or religion or factions are being used by both left and right. It's not just one side. They're used to get to power. And once they get to power, they forget whatever promise they made. And this is really the problem. It's a political problem. It's not a racial problem. And it's being used, unfortunately, for that purpose. But it's fairly evident. But I would strongly suggest you look at the Wikipedia and look at the Black Lives Matter, and you see what their positions are in generally. It was designed by two socialist communist ladies and one lady which is feminist, basically men type of organization. This is how it was formed. Forget about the ideology, but nobody is against blacks. Is there some prejudice against black? Obviously, in any large organization, you see all kinds of prejudices, but it's not dominant in the industry. It's not dominant in the society. It's amazing, actually. During these riots, I think close to about 15 or 16 police people died. A few of them got blinded, and their lives don't matter. Ironically, a lot of them were blacks. So black lives don't matter, but others does. It's just a political thing. We shouldn't get entangled with this in general. Is it an old wound that when they open it up, it creates emotion in people? Yes, of course it does. Was atrocities done to blacks? And in some cases today it's done? Yes, it does. But it's not dominant. the way they present it. There are a lot more blacks die. Actually, a few weekends ago, 17 blacks died in Chicago in one weekend. Nobody said anything. And they still took the police out of Chicago by the black mayor. I'm sorry, by the black organization police. They told them to back off. What happened? The blacks got killed. So their lives don't matter? It's a political thing. We shouldn't entangle ourselves in creating this kind of political abuse of race. Sorry about that. I hope I answered some of your questions. But those, believe me, I myself, I lived in a country that I was discriminated for my religion for close to 20 years. And I understand that, but we cannot blame practices of the old, which majority of them are abolished, and bring those to light today. But there is the legitimate, Black lives should be a legitimate elimination of discrimination against race. That's for sure. I'm not against it, or I'm not talking against it at all. I'm talking about just the movement itself, which is hijacked. That's all. Great.
So there's a question we have about Black Lives Matter again from Sue Emil. She's saying Black Lives Matter is not a political thing in some areas. It's not a matter of one size fits all. That's her comment. But I'll make it a question and ask, what is the Baha'i position on race unity? What is the Baha'i position on these racial divides? I think I remember with Louis Gregory, we're told to marry one another. That we're not just one family, but we should implement that in reality.
No, of course. The first marriage was sanctioned by Abdul Baha when that marriage occurred. So Baha'is this is 1912 we're talking about, where even churches, Christian churches were segregated in general. Now, in Baha'i meetings during that period, Abdul Baha made sure that blacks and whites sit across the same table. Now, as I said, the Baha'i doctrine promotes this race unity, religious unity as well. There is no difference between a good Christian and a good Baha'i. There is no difference as far as what is practiced in general. We don't discriminate. There is no infidel in Baha'i religion. And if we're colorblind in general, society would heal much faster. And we see the example of it in South Africa. If blacks that came to power would use their power to suppress the white, the whole community society would disintegrate. But they forgave the whites. And you see they started to expand progress. And now they have black administration, black politics there. The problems didn't go away, but at least, as I said, this issue of forgiveness of the past is the key to healing.
So there's a question, two of them from Edward Westwest, and he's asking, how can Black peoples gain equality and gain equity in these systems or governments?
Well, this is the whole point. It's the access. The blacks are same position as poor whites. It's the access to capital and ability to expand their their mode of creating jobs and businesses. Now they're assimilated in the economy. Ironically, there was a statistics that during the last 4 years, minority ownership of new businesses created jumped from, I think, 19% to 45% during last 4 years. And this is why, because the capital now is available and banks are loaning to them to start businesses. That's what you need to do. Make sure there is no discrimination based on color, religion, against real estate, against location, against businesses. So the banks have to be, and banks and basically organized watchdogs needs to make sure that this discrimination doesn't occur. And that's how you can fix it.
So there is a statement on this from the Universal House of Justice written on July 22nd, 2020. For those of you who are joining us today, please research this letter, and you can read the letter in its entirety on your own. I'll just be reading one paragraph excerpt, which will show the position of the Baha'i community on this matter of racism. Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. Within the context of the framework governing your activities, it is necessary to carefully examine the forces unfolding around you, to determine where your energies might reinforce the most promising initiatives, what you should avoid, and how you might lend a distinctive contribution. It is not possible for you to effect the transformation envisioned by Baha'u'llah merely by adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society. Your approach instead will be distinguished by maintaining a humble posture of learning, weighing alternatives in light of his teachings, consulting to harmonize differing views and shape collective action, and marching forward with unbreakable unity in serried lines. So it is about almost 2 hours in. I think that we are at a good stopping point. Do you agree?
Excellent, yes. I just have to mention, friends that I have that are Black, they're the purest heart you can find. It's just rare to see from that perspective. And it's ironic of atrocities that has been happening to them, but using socialist method to bring it to light is counterproductive, and it causes harm to Black community. Thank you very much, and hopefully we see you next Sunday.
Yes.
In a new presenter that is more agreeable to people's idea than I am.
Well, thank you for putting this out. We all understand from your talk that all these systems that are in place, this is what the Baha'i system came to replace.
Exactly.
And I see the conclusions on the screen. Stay away from politics, from partisan politics. Stay away from politically motivated movements based on these partisan political systems. Stay away from socialism and be independent, be happy. Good day, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.